Welcome. Thanks for joining today in this conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about how do we use our embodied mindfulness to tackle some of the things that are happening in the world. And we're going to look at things like our perceptions, our brain's predictions, and our biases, and even microaggressions. And how does all that come into the conversation when we're trying to develop leaders who are inclusive and impactful in amazing ways? So let's get started. Actually feel the video. And I don't know if, as you watched it, you were paying attention to what showed up in the body, and even what might have been some thoughts that showed up in the mind. And as we look at how does our mindful presence get cultivated and form the foundations for inclusive mindful leadership, there are a couple of things that we are asked to do, that we are invited to do in these modern times. And one of the ways I like to look at it is to think about mindfulness obviously as a way of being, but understanding that awareness happens in context. If nothing else, all that we have experienced over the last several years, we understand that context matters. So the one context is us being all in this room together today, being at this summit this week. And another context is there are things happening outside of these four walls. There is conflict, there is fear, there is discourse that is positive and not so positive. And these are happening in our families, in our communities, in our places of work, and in our nation and around the world. So when we think about how do I show up in the middle of that to create the conditions for belonging and inclusion, we often hear about DEI, right? And now DEIB, but there's DEIBA, there's adversity or ability. And oftentimes our brothers and sisters who have adversities or different abilities get left out of the equation. So thinking about mindful awareness and where does that start? I know I'm preaching to the choir, and that starts with each of us. So if we think about mindfulness and context, starting with ourselves and then moving out to others around us, and then bringing that to our surroundings, which all of which make up our ecosystems. But in the center is each one of us, and we have to travel with our awareness through each of those ripples. And when we do that, we have to consider, how do we show up? What do we think, do, feel, say? All of those things all at once, cascading our awareness as we navigate sort of the VUCA, whether it's the old version definition of VUCA or the one that Bill presented to us today, to think about it differently. And one thing that we do know is that a lot of our emotions are complex. We know they're associated with different things in neuroscience and complex circuitry in the brain, but we also know that they show up as physiological sensations in the body. So when we see a particular person or group of people, there are already things happening in the body about how we are responding to them that bubbles up and connects to our thoughts and our perceptions about how we value them or not. What is the role they play? What is the importance they have? And many of us have experienced times where we were unseen and unheard, maybe even dismissed in the room. And that's because of the way we start to get poured into with our life experiences. So I want to talk about this thing that I often refer to as paradox, prediction, and perception. So many of us know, perhaps, some of us may not, that the brain is a predicting organ. And it predicts every few moments the future it expects, and then we live the future that we expect. So we're always looking for evidence, essentially, to prove that we're right, even though we're not intentionally trying to do that. And as a result, our perceptions are formed, our filters are formed, and then we have to acknowledge that the only place the brain can pull from is our life experience. So we are subject to folly. We are subject to error. But at the same time, this is the thing that's so amazing, is that we can hold two things simultaneously. We can say that this limits our ability to see what is fully present, but at the same time, it's such an important brain function because the brain does these things to keep us safe, to be efficient. But I want to show you something to kind of bring the point home. If I ask you, how many large triangles do you see on this screen here? What would you say? You can just kind of yell it out. What do you think? 2. Now, those of you who didn't answer, this happens all the time. I'm convinced you didn't answer because you think it's a trick question. And you would be right. It is. In fact, there are no triangles on this screen, but the brain thinks that there are 2. This is called the kinesia effect. And it was originally created by an Italian psychologist in the mid-1950s named Gaetano Kinesia. And what he did was take these little graphical elements and just arrange them in a certain way on the page. And the brain says, but wait a minute, there's something that I know must fit in that space to make it complete. And so the brain goes through its internal sort of inventory and says, I remember from geometry, it must be those triangles. Therefore, triangles are what's there. Now, the other thing it does around prediction and perception is that it starts to change in little fine details what else is present. So sometimes I ask people, what do you notice about that front white triangle that's not really there? What do you notice? How does it appear to you? Closer, right? Like it's kind of lifted off the page. What about its color? Anything you notice there? Seems brighter, right? Also, neither of which is true. It is the same white intensity as the background color, and it is not lifted off the page. So the brain takes all of this, puts it together, and formulates the world that we see. And the world that we see is full of people like you and me in this room, all kinds of backgrounds. Now, anybody remember this map from elementary school? Yeah. Now, what do you notice about the continents? They're all almost equal in size. They may, this is the map that is used throughout the world. This is the map that tells us where we, whichever country, whichever continent we are in, this is how we stand, what our place is in the world. This is the world we see. And this is the world we don't see. This is the world that reflects the reality of the sizes of the continents as they really exist. And what you see here is that most of them fit in the continent of Africa. Anybody surprised by that? It blew my mind. Because why do you think our maps show it so differently? We think about how history is told, how people are categorized, what people's roles are in the world, and the evolution of our species. We make some things smaller and some things bigger. And there is a very powerful opportunity here when we think about how do we tell the story of our world? How do we tell the story of our organization and the people in it? Now, when I put this up here and I shared that with you, anybody notice any flicker, anything in the body kind of show up? Anybody have a thought or a feeling about this? Yes. 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 It is a lie. It's a myth about what we see and what we create. So the truth of this is also that we get to create and co-create our social and affective realities. It's what we all agree to be our collective truth. So when we think about our collective truth, there are certain ways that we feel, and when we use mindfulness to tap into what's showing up in my body right now, that I'm thinking about, wait, are you saying that all these countries fit in the continent of Africa? Are you saying that that person on my team actually did do a good job? And I have always kind of kept them over here because that's how I perceive them, and I have locked them in a box. That is the truth, and that is the reality that we have all agreed on. And as you can see, when we lock ourselves in these boxes, and then we try to show up as inclusive leaders that create ecosystems of belonging, that somehow we can miss the boat just a bit. Yes, did you want to say something? Yes.
But I first had that on my immediate response.
I just to disclose, I did not make this map. Had I made this map, Canada would be very prominently placed on it. So, but I think they were looking at, so all of North America.
West Thurston, yeah, internal. I think so wide and up there. I have no idea what that. I feel like, yeah, and like, as myself listening, easy thinking about it, I'm like,
yes. Thank you. Yes.
Then say that. So me, that's why I was thinking so kind of that. But I feel like as much as I fancy, that is how I feel about not saying that this is who I am. And it was so one that I so like I know you say how we think that is very considered an ultimate. So all things say that it's said as a little every good.
Yes. Thank you. And so that is part of the point of this discussion of how do we all feel heard, valued, and seen? Think about the ways and the images that we use in the workplace, in our communities, in our organizations that don't even reflect the people that we are serving, the people that we care about. They oftentimes don't even reflect ourselves, whether we're women, men, part of the LGBTQ community, or elsewhere. We have to think about who am I and how do I show up? And the who am I can be different. How do I see myself versus how do you attribute labels and define my identity for me? So let's talk about that. So, how I see myself, how you see me, this is what happens in our organizations. And so, I'll give you an example. So, identity, intersectionality, we all see ourselves a certain way. And then there are ways that people see us that we may or may not identify with. So, I'll give you an example. You see all these sort of culture, gender, age, religion, disability, ethnicity, race, class, sexual orientation, or sexual identity, all these things. And those things happen in the context of our systems and structures, of our processes and our policies. And that can be an organization, that can be a community, or that can be a nation. That all of things kind of bump up against each other. And because we identify ourselves and there might be some daylight between how I identify myself and you identify me, we start to have some challenges. Now, this notion of intersectionality is not new. It actually was a phrase that was coined in the late 1980s by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a law professor. It was used in sort of the women's rights space, but in present day, it's being used for a lot more than that. And the way that it's defined in her work is a complex coexistence of factors that describe how overlapping or intersecting social identities relate to societal and institutional systems and structures. So naturally, how I show up and walk through the world as a woman of color, as a tall woman, as a large woman, is going to be very different from somebody who is not like me. And the one thing that we do all the time, the one thing I always like to caution our mindfulness community is that we love to talk about sameness, right? We even have loving kindness and seeing similarities. We over-index on sameness. We are all human. And that is true. But we also live in times where it is time for yes and. Yes, we are all human. But the way I experience life is different from a man, is different from somebody who is a different religion. And we think in many ways by our behavior, even if we don't do it consciously, that somehow the sameness is better than the difference. When in fact, in order to have a common humanity that we talk about quite a bit, you have to have an appreciation, a care, a respect for both sameness and difference. They are equal, and they are both important and necessary. When we don't do that, we stop seeing people for who they are. We stop seeing the compassionate way to engage with others who might be experiencing something different. We stop minimizing the experiences of others. And even though we can't relate from a personal perspective, reaching in to that mindful place to be aware and connecting to compassion and empathy allows us to be able to say, tell me about that. I know that must have been difficult. Would you like to talk about it? Now, there's some really great work when we kind of connect that sort of mindful way of being. And the way I look at mindfulness, especially it's everywhere, but in the leadership space, that mindful presence influences, it's our state of being that informs our ways of doing and leading. So mindfulness isn't something to do, it's a way of being. And as a leader, we can't be mindful without also connecting and weaving in the compassion and the empathy and the wise action. Several years ago, something I read really gave me the confidence to step in and lean into this work more fully. And it was a blog post by Jeff Weiner called Managing Compassionately. Anybody that's heard me speak before has heard me credit this as being part of the inspiration for the work that I do now. And he was having a conversation with his mentor, Fred Kaufman, who wrote the book Conscious Business. And this is around 2012, 2013 or so. And he was still the CEO of LinkedIn, which he no longer is, of course. And he was saying to Fred, I want LinkedIn to be the most compassionate company in the world. And Fred listened to him, was very, just let him say what he needed to say, was very supportive. And then when Jeff finished, there was a pause. And Fred said, just remember that wisdom without compassion, well, compassion without wisdom is folly, and wisdom without compassion is ruthlessness. So when we move mindfulness into the workspace, the danger of not incorporating compassion is an extraction of what we want from people, rather than an honoring and a mutual collaboration of how do we co-create these outcomes that are not just good for you and for me and our teams and our organization, but also the ecosystems in which we operate. So they must happen at the same time. But when we strip out the humanity of it, we don't see others. We don't see that connection. And so if we look at the work of John A. Powell, he talks about breaking and bridging. And in the mindfulness community, that's very much like in groups and out groups, like us, not like us. So what do we do and how do we begin to create more bridging moments instead of breaking? And here's the thing. When people, especially these days where people are feeling very vulnerable, very tender, and that shows up in different ways. It can show up as anger, it can show up as frustration, impatience, projection, ego. When we don't pause to take the time to think about, okay, what is it that they are experiencing, instead of saying, and then leading into that's wrong, this is right, and this is the way. Now, we may be correct that ultimately the way we're going is the way that needs to be taken by all. But if we don't pause to have that conversation, to have the difficult conversations, I tell people all the time, get familiar with being uncomfortable. You don't have to get comfortable being uncomfortable, but get familiar with it. Because there's some hard work that we all need to do that we're inviting people to partake in. And as we do that, when we cultivate our muscle to be aware, so I think you have mindfulness, which is the foundation that fuels the opening of self-awareness. And self-awareness is that foundational skill set of the 4 pillars of emotional intelligence upon which everything rests. So when we build those muscles, then we can start to see outside of ourselves. Oh, as a leader, I noticed in the meeting you said X or Y. How do you think that went? What do you think happened there? And open up what the potential impact of those statements were. When we have biases, because this is how our brain works, right? So anybody, I love to give this example. Anybody ever seen the Jetsons from Future? Okay, a lot of people. Now, when I was a kid, I don't know about you, that was one of my favorite cartoons. Like, how cool was it that we could fly around in space saucers and do all these things? But if you think about it, there's nobody in the future that looks like me. Not a one. There's nobody that looks like my father, my brothers, my sisters, my cousins, my friends. Every one of us, my Black friends, my white friends, my Asian friends, my indigenous friends, we all watched that cartoon. And this is how sort of unconscious bias seeps in, right? We're not trying to do anything malicious. We're telling stories, we're creating entertainment, but at the same time, we're creating narratives that aren't reflective of reality, just like the maps. And when our unconscious biases are left untapped, and I propose that one of the ways to become aware and disrupt them is through the practice of mindfulness, so that we can start to check in and see and ask other people to also keep us accountable. But when we don't do that, we have things that come up like microaggressions. And microaggressions, despite its name, there's nothing micro or small about them at all. In fact, they have pretty macro impacts. Now, you may think, I've had this happen. My husband and I have a son, and for his younger years, we did not allow him to wear hoodies. We just didn't. He is tall for his age. He was a big kid. He was not allowed to wear hoodies in the neighborhood walking around. And a man said to me, "Don't you think you're going a little overboard? That's just a little much, don't you think?" And I'm like, "You don't have to worry about that. Your child," he was not Black, he was white. And I said, "Your child can walk outside the door, go to the store, walk around in a hoodie and be big for his age, and nobody sees that as threatening." I said, "But my son goes out and people start to be intimidated, to be a little fearful. He's big. And we all know that people who wear hoodies and are big and they look like me, there might be something we need to be aware of." Now, that's not everybody, of course, but it is a reality that some populations experience more than others. There's also these little questions that we get that turn into microaggressions, like, "Where are you really from?" Right? Anybody ever been asked that? Yes. So where are you really from? And this is the melting pot in our organizations. We have everything many times, even if our skin colors are the same, a lot of times there are other things that are not visible to the eye that are different, that invite us or sort of inspire us to ask these questions. And the questions themselves may not come from a harmful place. They may come from a very innocent place. But I always ask people, why is it that was so important to ask? So of course, I'm agreeing with you that you weren't intending to be anything other than curious. But when we think about unconscious bias and how left unmanaged, they turn into microaggressions, the question is, well, why that? Because the message underneath is that there is a default normal, and this doesn't fit it. And what is that default normal for you? Who shows up in your default normal? What do they sound like? What do they look like? This is another common one. And so people may say all the time, "But color shouldn't matter." And I agree, color shouldn't matter, but it does. It impacts how we walk through and experience life. But all of us in this room, which really gets me excited about the work in the mindfulness space, is that we can catch ourselves and we can say, I don't let color determine how I treat somebody or how I view them, but I must acknowledge that it plays some kind of role in the way they experience the world. And honoring that reality takes nothing away from anything else. And the myth of meritocracy, they don't need help. If they just worked harder, they'd be fine. But not everybody has a level playing field. So when we think about our biases and we think about how do we build the muscle around our mindfulness, we start to get into some really exciting territory. And I would say some of the things that are missing that we just started talking about compassion in the workplace, and even we're kind of in flux. People still want to use empathy, right? There's something about compassion that seems even softer than empathy, but I'm going to challenge us to go even further. What is love? Is it the object of attachment, devotion, admiration? Is it a sexual desire, tenderness? It's only an intimate love? Is it a strong affection? These are all things that Merriam-Webster's dictionary talks about. But I think a more ultimate, higher form of love is about wanting the best for another. When we can do that, we start to create really interesting conditions. And compassion is simply empathy in action. So there are a number of definitions out there. but this is what I use: the ability to experience and understand what others feel while simultaneously keeping a clear discernment about what's yours and the other person's feelings. That's empathy. But when we ask what will serve, then we put it into action. And so when we're in the workplace and we're being mindful and we're using our tools to cultivate that, we also have to ask these questions, because there's this really powerful thing that compassion does. It's one of the most important declarations of strength and courage known to humanity. It's difficult and powerful because it's not always a hug. Sometimes it's a direct conversation or strong action, but it's also infectious and influential and is universally recognized as a motivation that has the ability to change the world. So my father was a math teacher. I was never good at math, but I made my own math equation. Compassion plus love with moral courage, we talked about that a little bit earlier, is possibilities to the infinity. We get to co-create, and that's every aspect of our lives. So I'm going to leave you with this. And if you are so inclined, I'm going to invite you to close your eyes while I read it to you, and I want you to pay attention to how it feels in the body. You can keep your eyes open if you prefer. This is an excerpt from Isabel Wilkerson's Cast, published in 2020, and she says, "We are all homeowners who have inherited a house on a beautiful piece of land. But the soil is unstable and cracks have begun to develop in the foundation. And not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it. But here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bowed walls and fissures built into the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now, and any further deterioration is, in fact, on our hands." So why does that matter? Because no matter what we experience when we walk outside these doors into the world, the conflict, the anger, the fear, it is within all of us to show up, to choose differently. Because at the end of the day, what happens to one of us happens to all of us. Thank you.